Thanks for clicking. The Canadian real estate market needs to retain its value. This according to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Just a straight shooter with upper management written all over him.
Indeed, the comments come amid an interview with the Globe and Mail Cityscape interview, where the Prime Minister went over Canada's housing crisis. And while I don't usually cover politics on this channel, the Prime Minister's comments point to what we've talked about before, that the government really doesn't want to see house prices come down. And then the government has a bank problem. And, as we'll see, while the Prime Minister says the reason for that stance is because Canadians have so much of their net worth tied up in their home, as the bank's recent earnings report show, there may be other reasons why the government does not want real estate prices to fall. So what I want to do today is very briefly go over Trudeau's interview, take a look at why the government may not want home prices to fall, and then discuss some implications. The Bank of Canada is set to make its much anticipated interest rate announcement next week on June 5th, and while the media is pushing the narrative that there's a 65% chance of an interest rate cut at that announcement, the market, the ones with the money, the ones with the skin in the game, are now only pricing in a 39% chance of that cut. Sorry, 35. It was 39 when I started recording.
We're going to the moon!
We will obviously have an update out on the bank's interest rate announcement and its subsequent press conference on this channel. Click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, let's get into this interview. On to the interview. As mentioned, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau noted in his interview with the Globe and Mail that the government is not seeking to see Canadians lose the value of their homes.
Housing needs to retain its value. It's a huge part of people's potential for retirement and future and nest egg.
And I think this argument is fair enough. According to a recent StatsCan report, real estate represents 55% of the wealth of Canadians. As such, Trudeau says that it's not the government's intention to see Canadians lose the value of their homes.
So yes, we need to keep housing stable and valuable.
Yet, it's not clear that a genuine concern over the welfare of Canadians and retirees is the only motivation behind Trudeau's comments.
You don't love me!
Indeed, a closer look at the report to shareholders recently released by the banks shows that the government may be a little bit more concerned with bank viability and its own than it is with the general well-being of Canadians. Let's take TD as an example. Looking at its report to shareholders, we find that 40% of TD's outstanding mortgages are over 25 years. And as anyone who has ever had a mortgage knows, over the first 5-10 years of a mortgage, barely any of the payments go towards principal. Meaning the value of the mortgages on TD's books are not decreasing very quickly.
What did I say?
Let's take a brief look at someone who bought midway through the pandemic, back in December of 2020, who got a 5-year fixed at 1.84 from TD. They bought that benchmark priced home of $607,000, and after 5 years, they'll renew in December of 2025, and the total amount owing will be $506,000. Which isn't too bad considering the current benchmark price of a home in Canada is $719,000. Those borrowers have about $200,000 in equity and a loan-to-value of about 70. But the pre-pandemic benchmark price of a home was $540,000. If the benchmark price moved back to pre-pandemic pricing, that same homeowner would be dangerously close to having their home underwater. That is, owing less on the home than it's worth. Yet, according to the Bank of Canada's Affordability Index, that house price, that pre-pandemic house price, was the last time that Canadian real estate was relatively affordable.
You don't want that.
Now, granted, that is just one example, and there will obviously be extremes at one side or the other. But 26% of TD's mortgages are at least 25 years, with another 16% being over 35. That same mortgage over 30 years would owe $530,000 at the end of the term. Meaning, TD, and as we'll see the government, really wouldn't want to see that house price return to $540,000. It's not clear that the government or the banks are going to want to see prices return to pre-pandemic affordability levels when the drop in prices that would be needed to facilitate that affordability would result in such a large portion of the mortgages held by the banks being very close or even actually underwater. And this is by no means just a TD problem. In its last report to shareholders, RBC noted it had 40% of its mortgages over 25 years, and CIBC was at 38%. That's a lot of mortgages, the majority of which were probably taken out over the last 5 years, which could be potentially underwater if prices were restored to their pre-pandemic levels. And it's not like this is normal either. In Q1, right before the pandemic, TD only had 27% of its mortgages with so little principal being paid off. RBC was at 27%. CIBC was pretty much the same. Now, very briefly, the usual suspects, Canada's titans of sales professionalism, will no doubt say that when the Bank of Canada cuts rates, affordability will be returned. But if we look at the Bank of Canada's index, affordability continued to get worse even when interest rates were zero. But so what? 40% of the mortgages held by the banks have amortizations greater than 25 years, meaning not a lot of principal is being paid off. And if prices were to return to pre-pandemic levels, a lot of those mortgages would be dangerously close to, or actually, underwater. But so what? Does that matter? Well, back in 2008, about 20% of US mortgages were underwater. Now, that's not necessarily a problem, as was noted at the time. It's not really a problem so long as borrowers continue to make their payments. But when borrowers don't make their payments, if we have a recession, if we have an economic downturn, then, as we saw in 2008, it can become a real problem. Which brings us full circle to the Prime Minister not wanting values to fall, as 21.9% of the mortgages on just TD's books are insured. They're either insured by CMHC, which is 100% guaranteed by the government, or insured by one of the private insurers, which is 90% guaranteed by the government as well. Were home values to fall back to January of 2020 levels and affordability was restored, but we had an economic downturn and Canadians missed their payments, then the banks could have a real problem on their hands, as would the government. Now, according to the Prime Minister, though the government doesn't want to see values fall, I don't think he wants to see them go up anymore either.
I think anyone who hopes for the housing prices to remain on the kind of trajectory they've been on over the past decade or two should maybe think about what kind of society and world they want to live in, where only people who either inherited wealth or had very, very good timing and started launching a startup or whatever are able to actually get into a more expensive market.
I'll make that deal.
And yeah, we can see this in the affordability measures that the government has introduced over the past few years, none of which have the full force of law, and all of which have been characterized very much as simple window dressing, not really intent to move the market whatsoever. My guess is the government is trying to thread a very, very tough needle, hoping that home prices stagnate over the next 5-10 years, giving us time for incomes and building to catch up without incurring a bank problem, without incurring major losses in the real estate industry, causing a problem for both the banks and the government. And while a little off topic, though directly related, with the US set to borrow so much over the next 5 and 10 years, and with them having problems doing so, as we saw in the bond market yesterday, it's not exactly out of the realm of possibility that home prices aren't going back to the moon. So, as we talked about so many times on this channel, the government does not want to see a rapid decrease in Canadian house prices. The Prime Minister noted that this is because Canadians have so much of their wealth tied up in housing, but a closer look at the data from the banks, a closer look at the mortgages being held by our major banks, show that there could be other major economic factors at work. With all of that said, the government may not want house prices to come down, but governments rarely ever want to see asset prices come down either. As we saw in 2008, 100% of the time, economic factors will ultimately win out. Whether or not the Canadian economy can continue to sustain current prices or even push them up further remains to be seen. But we'll obviously continue to cover that on this channel. Click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates. But for now, thanks so much for watching.